Plato lived from 428 to 423 BCE during the Greek classical period. He was a student of Socrates and became the teacher of Aristotle. Plato's influence on Western thought cannot be underestimated. He established a philosophical school, the Academy, which remained in existence until 83 BCE, and which was re-established for about 100 years, starting in 410 CE. Plato's influence is evident in Hellenistic Jewish sources, in the Christian Church Fathers, and in early Islamic thought and beyond. Indeed, as 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead famously said,
"The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato."
Plato's writings are comprised of dialogues, all of which, except for the Laws, feature Socrates. We are looking only at a portion of one dialogue, the Laws. So of course, we offer the usual caveat that we're only trying to pull on a few threads and not to offer an authoritative reading of all of the Laws, much less of all of Plato. The characters in the Laws include an unnamed Athenian stranger, Clinias of Crete, and Megillus of Lacedaemon. The Laws concerns questions about the ideal structure and content of specific laws, as we saw concerning Solon the lawgiver. But the Laws also asks more fundamental questions about the sources of law. In particular, it asks whether God, or the gods, or the divine, precedes the state, the republic, as the source of law. In fact, in the Greek text, the first word of the Laws is God, theos. We could rearrange an English translation to read,
"God or a man, strangers. Which do you consider the source of the structure of the laws?"
The Cretan Clinias responds emphatically,
"God, stranger. God, most rightly."
Much of the dialogue in the Laws will probe what is meant by God or a god, and whether that instinct holds true. Just before our first reading selection from Book 1, after much back and forth, we might sympathize with the exasperated Clinias when he tells the Athenian stranger,
"I have some difficulty keeping pace with you."
The Athenian stranger tries an analogy to refocus the conversation. Suppose, the Athenian stranger suggests, that human beings are puppets of the gods, and that our inward affections are like strings that pull us to opposite actions, which represent the dividing line between goodness and badness. The phrase inward affections translates the Greek word pathos. We could also translate this as passions. The Greek word translated actions is praxis, and we could translate this as practices. The word translated goodness is arete, which could be translated as excellence. The word translated badness is kakia, which in opposition to arete is a qualitative judgment, not just isolated bad acts, but a state of moral failure. The word dividing line, dorismene, is a participle form of orizo, which can mean to mark out, divide, or establish a boundary. The Athenian stranger offers here then what we would today call a moral psychology. Notice that the human being doesn't exist apart from, or above, or before the passions represented by the puppet strings. Human beings rather are comprised of these opposing passions toward moral excellence and moral failure. Notice also that the passions are closely related to practices. The passions and resulting practices form the boundary between moral excellence and moral failure. And finally, notice that there is no middle ground or moral mediocrity in this account. The presumptive goal is arete, excellence, and failure to achieve it is kakia, failure. But the Athenian stranger doesn't stop there. He mentions the leading string, golden and holy, of calculation, entitled the public law of the state. This string, because it is made of gold, is both flexible and uniform. In relation to this golden string, the Athenian stranger introduces a possible human response. It's a string every man should always follow and know how lead hold of or never forsake, and with which we should cooperate. The Greek word translated calculation is logismos, meaning calculation, accounting, or reasoning, derived from logos, a very rich term with meanings that can include word, speech, and reason, and which, we will see, is taken up in the New Testament and in Christian thought to refer to Christ. The phrase translated the public law of the state in the Greek is tes poleos koinon nomon. Koinos most basically means common or shared in common, and again, the concept of koinonia, a sharing and a common fellowship, will be taken up in the New Testament to describe the community of the church. Here, we could rephrase the English translation of tes poleos koinon nomon to say the common law of the community. Logismos, the Athenian stranger says, is gentle rather than forceful, so it requires helpers, hupertes, meaning an attendant, servant, or staff officer, to ensure that the community is allowing itself to be pulled along by that golden thread. To paraphrase the Athenian stranger, people are pulled by competing passions toward moral excellence or failure in the practices of everyday life. Reason draws us toward excellence, but we can either resist or cooperate with reason. The common law of the community embodies principles of reason applied to the practices of life in the community. But the common law doesn't administer itself. The community requires capable people who can understand and administer the common law. The discourse between the Athenian stranger, Clinias, and Megillus then continues over the Greek custom of drunken wine parties. The stranger points out that drunkenness intensifies our passions, leading us away from reason and causing us to embarrass ourselves. The fear of embarrassment helps guide people away from public drunkenness. When a person avoids the embarrassment of public drunkenness, he is unafraid to appear in the community. Paradoxically, fear leads to confidence and courage. Similarly, the fear of the punishments of the law helps guide people towards the excellences of reason and the practices embodied in the common law. Our excerpt from Book 4 picks up after the Athenian stranger Clinias and Megillus have engaged in considerable discourse about different forms of law and different political arrangements. Just before the section we're reading, the Athenian stranger asks everyone to assume that God is present when the state is established, and then asks whether the form of the state should be a democracy, an oligarchy, an aristocracy, or a monarchy. Clinias and Megillus puzzle over whether the states where they live could be called any of these. The Athenian stranger responds that these are not proper names for the state, polis, but rather are merely ways in which a state can be arranged, oikesis, from the word for household, oikos. Instead of naming the state after these contingent arrangements, the stranger says, it should be named after the God who is the true ruler of rational men, literally of those who possess nous, or mind. Clinias asks the big question, who is that God? The stranger answers, as he often does, with a story. In this case, it's a Greek origin story of the Golden Age, when humanity was furnished with everything in abundance and of spontaneous growth. The ruling titan, that is, pre-Olympian god, Kronos, who ruled over the world, knew that human beings were prone to pride, hubris, and injustice, adikia. Plato doesn't give Kronos' backstory here, but in the broader Greek mythology, Kronos was the son of Gaia, earth, and Uranus, sky. While in the Platonic writings, he was the son of Oceanus, who formed the waters that encircled the earth, and Tethys, mother of the river gods, who were themselves children of Gaia and Uranus. To keep human beings from pride and injustice, Kronos appointed daemons, daimonas, over them. To our modern ears, whether we've been schooled by horror movies or religious ideas about demons or both, this sounds frightening. But the daimonas in the ancient Greek context were lower gods or goddesses, and or the powers of fate, and or a kind of motivating impulse, which were not inherently malign. In fact, the stranger says that the daimonia were appointed because of the God's love of humanity, philanthropos. When a state, whether it be an oligarchy or a democracy, has no God for its ruler, there the people have no rest from ills and toils. Again, as a place marker, we'll come back to how the New Testament and the Christian Church Fathers employed the concept of demons and rulers of this age, which can seem weirdly backwards and superstitious, but which supported a sophisticated political theology in which Christ and the Church supplanted the oppressive rulership of Rome. At this point, we would expect the Athenian stranger to name some god or gods, whether the head Olympian god Zeus, who in Greek is often simply referred to as Theos, or some other god or goddess. But he doesn't do so. Instead, he says, we imitate the time of Chronos,
when we order both our homes and our states in obedience to the immortal element within us, giving to reasons ordering the name of law.
That is, instead of referring to God or the gods, he refers to something inside us. So, what is the stranger saying? Is he suggesting the old religious myths might not be true, but that they tell us something about ourselves nonetheless? Is he, in the end, an atheist, not a believer in the gods? Is he a rationalist who thinks reason finally dispenses with our need for the gods? Some modern readers take Plato, and in some of Plato's other dialogues, Socrates, to be saying just that. Indeed, in the Apology, Plato's dialogue relating to Socrates' execution in Athens, the charge against Socrates is that he is an atheist and is corrupting the youth of Athens. Socrates' response in the Apology is that he does believe in the gods of Athens, but is guided by his own personal daimonion. Whether that personal daimonion was in fact a god, or simply Socrates' internal convictions remains in debate. Socrates did at least believe in a kind of transcendent order of the universe, and Plato further developed that concept of transcendence. Whether the Athenian stranger represents Socrates' views or Plato's or something in between is sometimes unclear. Once again, though, the Greek in this section of the laws is richer than our somewhat stilted translation suggests. The immortal element within us is athanasias enesti, immortal essence or being. Enesti is a form of the verb emi, to be. This is not here referring to a being separate from ourselves, such as a god or daimonion, but it does suggest that some aspect of our being is immortal. When the text then says this immortal element gives to reasons ordering the name of law, the word reason is nous or mind. The stranger then notes that if a person or state is possessed of a soul which strives after pleasures and lusts, the law will be trampled upon, and there will be no means of salvation. Soul is suke, and salvation is soteria, meaning safety, deliverance, and preservation. The concepts of being, nous or mind, and suke or soul have deep resonances in other parts of Plato's thought. The soul, Plato thought, was external, both pre-existing and outliving its connection with the physical body. The soul for Plato was comprised of three parts: the logos relating to reason, the thymos relating to spirit, and the eros relating to desire. Reality, in Plato's thought, was comprised most basically in the unchanging, perfect realm of the forms, Greek ideia, or ideas. The forms provided the universal pattern for any particular thing, and particular material things were never as basic or perfect as the forms. The soul was not itself a form, but as something immaterial and eternal, it could perceive the forms through nous, mind. When we gain true knowledge, Plato thought, either we are enabled to see clearly past momentary material realities to the deeper realities of the forms, and/or we are able to recollect ideas already embedded in the soul through past lives. Whether Plato held firmly to one of these theories or both is a matter of considerable debate. If the Athenian stranger represents Plato's thought, then, he is suggesting that law concerns the human ability to perceive transcendent truths from the eternal realm of the forms that preserve human society against hubris and injustice and promote abundance and growth. Clinias readily agrees that all of this must be so. But then the Athenian stranger adds a twist in the form of an apparently proverbial saying.
Justice always benefits the stronger.
Whether the polity is tyranny or a democracy, the person or party in power will arrange things to their advantage and call it justice. So, is the Athenian stranger a cynical legal realist after all? No, he uses this proverbial truth to lead Clinias into a discussion of who should administer the laws.
This role should not be assigned based on wealth or status, but should go to the person who is most obedient to the laws and wins the victory for obedience in the state.
Further, the stranger says, these officers should be called ministers of the law, huperites, the word we encountered earlier, meaning servant, attendant, or staff officer, rather than magistrates, archons, rulers, or chief commanders. In other words, the person administering the law must recognize that he too stands under the law.
When the administrators of laws possess this kind of character, salvation, and all the blessings that the gods bestow on states will follow.
The stranger then offers a kind of poetic address, perhaps derived in part from the mythical poet Orpheus.
O men that God who, as old tradition tells, holdeth the beginning, the end, and the centre of all things that exist, completeth his circuit by nature's ordinance in straight unswerving course. With him followeth justice always, as avenger of them that fall short of the divine law, and she, again, is followed by every man who would fain be happy, cleaving to her with lowly and orderly behaviour, but whoso is uplifted by vainglory, or prideth himself on his riches or his honours or his comeliness of body. And through this pride joined to youth and folly, is inflamed in soul with insolence, dreaming that he has no need of ruler or guide, but rather is competent himself to guide others. Such an one is abandoned and left behind by the god, and when left behind he taketh to him others of like nature, and by his mad prancings throweth all into confusion. To many, indeed, he seemeth to be some great one, but after no long time he payeth the penalty, not unmerited, to justice, when he bringeth to total ruin himself, his house, and his country. Looking at these things, thus ordained, what ought the prudent man to do, or to devise, or to refrain from doing?
Clinias gives the answer.
Every man ought so to devise, as to be of the number of those who follow in the steps of the god.
Our selection from Book 5 of the Laws gives a statement about the purpose of the laws from the Athenian stranger, in the midst of a long discourse about wealth, power, and equality. He says,
Now the fundamental purpose of our laws was this, that the citizens should be as happy as possible, and in the highest degree united in mutual friendship.
It's important to note that happy here is the superlative of eudaimon, eudaimonia. It has the sense of abundance and flourishing, not merely a pleasant emotional state, and that the word friendship is philoi, which also means belovedness. The thought is that the laws promote the greatest flourishing within a community held together by deep bonds of common affection. We should note that in part of this discourse that we didn't read, leading up to this great statement, the stranger mentioned that the law should observe another old saying of Pythagoras. Friends, philon, have all things really in common, koina. He then holds up as ideal a state
in which there is community of wives, children, and all chattels, and all that is called private is everywhere, and by every means rooted out of our life, and so far as possible it is contrived that even things naturally private have become in a way communized. Eyes, for instance, and ears and hands seem to see, hear, and act in common, and that all men are, so far as possible, unanimous in the praise and blame they bestow, rejoicing and grieving at the same things, and that they honor with all their heart those laws which render the state as unified as possible.
So, we may wonder if our concept of eudaimonia is really the same as the Athenian strangers, or if any kind of communal notion of human flourishing leads to a koinonia in which individual differences must be entirely erased. Perhaps some of our concerns about the Athenian stranger's ideal vision are somewhat erased by his more moderate tone in our excerpts from Book 9 and 10. In Book 9, the stranger acknowledges that no one really has the intellect and character to administer the ideal state perfectly. In the real world, since we can't embody perfect reason, we choose what is second best. Ordinance, taxis, that is, an arrangement or order, and law, nomos, which see and discern the general principle, but which are unable to see every instance in every detail. More closely translated, perhaps, which look and understand much, but cannot see and understand everything. In other words, the law and its administration can encompass a general range of circumstances based on principles broadly related to the ideal. But the specifics of any given case usually must be left to the more detailed discernment and experience of the community, including, as the stranger goes on to discuss, through adjudication in the courts. Finally, in Book 10, the Athenian stranger gets deeper into the question of the real origin of the law. The discussion begins with a deep question about chance, touke, fortune or fate, and nature, physis, in relation to reason, nous, and art, techne. Some philosophers, the stranger notes, claim that everything, the whole heaven and all that is in the heaven, and all animals too, and plants, arose through nature and chance, and not through reason or art. For these philosophers, art then arose as a later product of nature and chance. From art come later playthings, such as painting and music, which share, metexo, little in the truth, as well as some more serious things, like medicine, agriculture, gymnastics, and to some extent, politics, which share, koinoo, to a small extent in nature. The views summarized here are those of the atomists, Leucippus and Democritus. As their moniker suggests, they postulated long before modern chemistry that everything is made up of atoms moving randomly in a void. Based on this supposition, they argued that sensations such as hot, cold, taste, and sound were not real, that is, not related anything external to the organism experiencing a sensation. Likewise, the Athenian stranger says, these philosophers argue that the gods exist by art, techne, and not by nature, physis, based on laws that differ from place to place. In other words, the gods do not really exist, but are invented by humans to support the laws and social norms that happen to arise out of the different circumstances in which people happen to be living. Note that if the Athenian stranger is indeed here describing the atomist views about the gods, it probably is not a fully accurate description. Young people, the Athenian stranger says, are taught this by men of science, sophos, those skilled, clever, or wise, who maintain that the height of justice is to succeed by force. Clinias is horrified that young people are being corrupted in this way, and the stranger agrees. There's an irony embedded here, because Socrates, who might be a model for the Athenian stranger, was convicted for corrupting the youth, but the stranger is amplifying some of the teachings of Socrates. The remedy elicited by the stranger from Clinias is not to force people to believe in the gods, but to persuade them through good arguments. Clinias states the central argument.
Gods exist, and law itself he must also defend in art, as things which exist by nature, or by a cause not inferior to nature, since according to right reason they are the offspring of mind.
The word reason here is the word logos, and the word mind is nous. This statement reflects a long-standing debate in Greek philosophy about whether nature, physis, or convention, nomos, also translated as law, comes first. Does nature, that which is, shape and define what convention or law is and should be? Or does convention or law, a human construction, shape what we might think nature means? You should note that this is exactly the same debate we engage in today when we contrast natural law theories to legal realist or legal positivist theories. It's not a new problem. You might expect that Clinias here would take the side of physis being preeminent, but he doesn't quite do so. Mind or reason, nous, comes before nomos, physis, and techne. This is central to Plato's metaphysics and to the theory of law developed in the Laws. It's not a natural law theory of the sort that would simply try to derive an ought from an is, as if a brute fact of nature could give rise to a moral imperative in the form of a transcendent law. Rather, it's a theory about the fundamental principle of reason, which is the source of everything that exists, and to which nomos, human convention or law, should conform. And it is particularly the lawgiver's duty to persuade that the laws are more than merely clever inventions maintained only by force.
For when the greatest laws are being destroyed by wicked men, who is more bound to come to their rescue than the lawgiver?
Does this then make Plato a kind of monotheist, who understands natural law as something produced from the mind of the creator God? Not quite. But we will see that some of the Hellenistic Jewish, patristic Christian, and medieval Islamic thinkers adapted this line of Platonic reasoning to help explain their own conceptions of God, creation, and law.